Good evening. Welcome to the Muslim Street on WTAN 1340. This is Layla Abdelaziz with my co-host Malik Aziz. Again, you're listening to the Muslim Street, the latest and greatest on the Muslim world, here in America and abroad.
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.
Welcome to the Muslim Street. This is Malik Aziz. My co-host Layla Abdelaziz will be joining us in the third segment, the second half of the show. She's off site at an important fundraiser with the mayor of the city of Tampa. Today we will deal with Malcolm X. We will deal with him from an academic perspective, a revolutionary perspective. We have with us Dr. Oba T Shaka. Oba T Shaka is a longtime warrior, scholar, activist, revolutionary, a renowned speaker all around the globe. For 38 years, he was professor at San Francisco State University in the Bay Area, where he is now a professor emeritus. And that is Dr. T Shaka, who has written a number of books. In one particularly, he wrote a book on Malcolm X, the political legacy of Malcolm X. And I got to tell you, I've read just about everything on Malcolm. One of the best pieces on Malcolm that you can get, the political legacy of Malcolm X. Pick it up. He's also the author of The Art of Leadership, Volume 1 and 2, The Return to the African Mother, Principle of Male and Female Equality, Volume 1. His latest piece, The Integration Trap, The Generation Gap, another excellent piece, The Cause by Choice Between Two Cultures. Dr. T Shaka, welcome to the Muslim Street.
Thanks. Glad to have a chance to talk to you.
Absolutely. So as we come up on a couple days before the anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X, the Muslim Street has been focusing in on the month of February, Black History Month, and particularly with Malcolm X. Dr. Shaka, back in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, we saw a resurgence of Malcolm X with the hip-hop crowd. What we're seeing now is a second resurgence, if you will, of Malcolm X in the Muslim activist community, particularly amongst immigrant Muslims, be they Palestinian Americans fighting for the liberation of Palestine, from the Indo-Pac Asian bloc. We see a lot of the young intellectuals, as well as the ideologues who are organizing all over this country in response to Islamophobia, the oppression of Muslims in this country. They're grabbing hold to Malcolm X speeches, Malcolm's political framework, to mitigate against their oppression. What do you have to say about this? What I feel and what I see on the street is the resurgence of Malcolm X, and particularly with this crowd.
Well, I think with the Arab Spring, particularly starting in Tunisia and spreading across North Africa, and then you have resistance movements in the heart of Africa, one that's occurring in Senegal right now that's not being reported. Much more reporting went on in the Arab Spring, that there's a response to the IMF, World Bank structural adjustment policies that have really driven people into abject poverty. That, of course, has put Africa on the bottom in terms of economic progress. So that has, in turn, spurred and helped to inspire the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Oakland, Occupy movements in this country. So there's that reaction, and I think that Malcolm was someone who had a global perspective in the Nation of Islam, and outside the Nation of Islam. And when he made his first trip to Africa after being forced out of the Nation of Islam, he did spend time in Lebanon and met with the PLO and voiced support for the Arab liberation, though his primary focus was on African liberation, and was critical of Israel and Zionism. So Malcolm had a global internationalist perspective, and he was a revolutionary. So he supported radical change wherever it was in the world. That was also a part of a progression in the movement, because I was in CORE at that time, Congress of Racial Equality, from 60 to 65, and a wing of us, I led the Black Nationalist wing within CORE, had moved to a similar posture, not so much because of Malcolm, but because of what we had learned in the struggle. And then also Malcolm represented the sharpest, clearest articulation of that position, also inside of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then with King in terms of his war against his opposition to the war in Vietnam. So, Malcolm brought that kind of perspective, a radical perspective, with both a Muslim Pan-Africanist and a nationalist. And so, I think I can see why, with this mounting motion in the Islamic world, that there would be an identification with Malcolm.
Yeah. Dr. Shaka, I consider you one of my mentors, definitely one of the foremost experts and scholars over the years on Malcolm X throughout the world. You've lectured on a consistent basis on the issue of Malcolm X. As you look at this period of Malcolm's life that you talked about, him after the Nation of Islam, his travels through the Middle East, his travels through Africa, his bumping up of his developing positions with Gamal Nasser and Ahmed Ben Bella and the rest. Can you talk about Malcolm in terms of these interactions that he had with these revolutionary giants at that time on the African continent, as they too were coming out of European imperialism on the African continent? How did that affect Malcolm as he developed?
Well, I think what's generally not appreciated, because a number of writers, including Manning Marvel with his book that's come out recently, and then others that have written before, particularly Haley, because of the certain missing chapters, which there's something behind that the scholars don't know. I'll get into it later. Or this book, Malcolm X, The Evolution of a Revolutionary by Breitman. Either there's been a tendency to try and minimize his revolutionary orientation, or if it's conceded that it's something that occurred after he left the Nation of Islam. And I think the first thing to really understand is it's in prison that Malcolm not only woke up, as he documents in the autobiography, and transforms his mindset in a very deep way. And I think this is one of the first things that I think is relevant to everybody. I don't care what your color is. You really can't make revolution on the outside, change a system, if you don't change yourself. And Malcolm underwent a deep transformation, as he put it, of his philosophy, his attitude, his thought pattern, communication, and behavior pattern. He went through a transformation. I went through a similar transformation. Didn't copy his. Mine occurred before I knew about his, though after his. And it happened to a number of people in the Black liberation movement. And that's been a weakness of many so-called revolutionary movements. They can talk about changing systems, but how do people transform themselves? But in prison, one of the most important things that's generally not appreciated is Malcolm developed not only a nationalist orientation, a Black nationalist orientation, and an Islamic one through the Nation of Islam, which was special to the United States, but he developed a revolutionary orientation. But it was different from how most revolutionaries develop. Most revolutionaries develop locally, usually through reform movements, nationally, and then internationally. And over time, they come to see the need to transform a system radically. That makes them a revolutionary. King moved through that kind of process. So did I, many others. But Malcolm's revolutionary orientation was grounded in an internationalist perspective from the beginning. And in part, that's due to the Garvey roots of his family. But it's largely due what's generally not understood, that in prison, Malcolm's first apprenticeship, where he studied under a master, was not Elijah Muhammad, though he was learning through him. it was through Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson was the first influence on Malcolm. He would listen to Robeson when he was in prison. And the proof of the pie is in the pudding. Robeson was anti the Korean War. Malcolm opposed the Korean War, refused to enter the draft in World War II. But Malcolm would later embrace the posture, being the first major leader in this country to oppose the war in Vietnam.
Yeah, Dr. Shaka, we're going to come back on the other side. Hold on with us. You can call us, line up at 866-826-1340. You listen to WTAN, The Muslim Street.
You're listening to WTAN 1340, The Muslim Street. You can follow us at muslimstreet.net or on Facebook, Muslim Street.
Larry G here again. The Prescription Addiction Radio Show, Breaking the Silence, is back on Tan Talk Sunday nights from 9 to 11. The only radio show in America that asks why business, industry, and churches sit silent while every community continues to fight a growing drug problem, both legal and illegal. The only radio show in America that explores the politics of drugs without the politicians. Brought to you by Novus Medical Detox, Suncoast Rehabilitation, and Chamberlain, Butler, and Crow.
Hi, this is Layla Abdelaziz. Join me every Sunday, 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. for The Muslim Street with my co-host, Malik Aziz. The Muslim Street will be bringing you the latest and greatest from the Muslim world. The Muslim Street will bring you a unique perspective on Muslim America, as well as Muslims living abroad. We'll be taking your calls and questions every Sunday, again from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. on WTAN 1340. Join us for the Muslim Street.
My name is Hassan Shibli. I'm the Executive Director of CARE Tampa, www.cairtampa.org, and I listen to The Muslim Street on Tan Talk Radio every Sunday at 8 p.m.
African Americans, who are so-called Negro. One of the reasons that it is bad for us to continue to just refer to ourselves as so-called Negro, that's negative. When we say so-called Negro, that's pointing out what we aren't, but it isn't telling us what we are. We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America. Our forefathers weren't the Pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
Welcome back to the Muslim Street. We're on with Dr. Oba T Shaka from the Bay Area of California. Please call us at area code 727-441-3000 locally. All over the nation at 866-826-1340. That was the sounds of Malcolm X giving a speech back in the 1960s, shortly before he was assassinated, February 21st, 1965, as we approach the anniversary of his assassination. Dr. T Shaka, before we went to break, we were talking about Paul Robeson. Very interesting period as you talk about Malcolm's development and his consciousness. It is too at a time when Dr. Du Bois starts on a Pan-African mission. Dr. Du Bois later resided and passed away in Ghana on a Pan-African ideology. Can you talk about a little bit about some more about Paul Robeson, his effect on Malcolm, that period of Dr. Du Bois going through a transition himself?
Yeah, it's very important because while Elijah had this religious impact on Malcolm, Malcolm was always more political than he was religious, though he was religious. And Robeson affected his international orientation. Malcolm had inclinations towards a revolutionary posture, even though he had been waylaid through street activity. And Robeson was a revolutionary, and Malcolm embraced that. In fact, he sent some letters to the FBI and other government officials telling them that he was a communist, which he was not, but it was his way of kind of trying to anger them, and it scared Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm adopted the speech pattern of Robeson, which he used animal analogies in his speech things, and Malcolm was very much interested in language, as Robeson was himself a linguist. So, when you see his travels in the Middle East, North Africa, and Africa after being forced out of the nation, that's an extension of views that he had shaped in prison. Now, the thing when he comes out of prison, joins the nation, you don't hear him talking too much about Pan-Africanism. He identifies with Africa, but it generally in this framework of the Bandung Conference, which was held in Sukarno, in Indonesia under Sukarno, which Asians, Africans, Latins, anything other than whites from the U.S. or the Western Europe could attend. And that fit the framework of the Nation of Islam, which was blackism, that we're black, which means black, brown, red, and yellow. So Malcolm was trying to stay within the confines of the Nation of Islam's outlook, while at the same time stressing, internationalizing, or identifying with the struggles in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So his travels in Egypt, his trip on the Hajj, his travel in Lebanon, and then his main work in Africa is an outgrowth of this international work, and it is then consciously, which he was always conscious of Pan-Africanism, but it is cast as a Pan-African thrust, all Africans, unifying African people. And I suppose the highlight of that move in Africa was his meeting with Kwame Nkrumah, which he talked very little about. And I think it was wise that he did, though it would be good if we knew more about those meetings. But he met with, what's interesting about both North Africa with Islamic leaders and the heart of Africa is that he met with progressive and radical leaders. I mean, that's who he identified with. So Nkrumah, who was leading the Pan-African thrust, had, as you point out, Du Bois working on the Encyclopedia Africana. Julius Nyerere, who I met with in 1979, who was doing some very good work in Tanzania around Ujamaa villages and providing health care and education to the people, and Sekou Touré and Jomo Kenyatta, who was not as radical as he thought, but who identified with the Mau Mau. So that was a part of an international strategy that developed. And that strategy became a strategy of internationalizing the civil rights movement. That became his human rights strategy. That's essentially what it was. He was trying to radicalize it, introduce nationalism and radical thought into it, though it was already being radicalized on its own. And he was trying to take it outside this country to do what Robeson had done when he had raised the issue of human rights violations, charging U.S. with genocide. Malcolm turns this into a human rights campaign. And if you listen to Message to the Grassroots, in one of his message speech, he slips and says, we're going to charge the U.S. with genocide. Then he jumps into the human rights strategy, which shows you Robeson's influence on him, though he had his own strategy. So that was kind of, Malcolm saw everything through a global lens. That's how his mind worked.
As we talk about Malcolm and the movement and his development in his Pan-African philosophy, particularly during this period after he left the Nation of Islam and through his travels, he looks at the formulation of the Organization of African Unity, comes back, he devises an organization in Harlem, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, sort of patterns it after it. Dr. Shaka, my question is, as we look at the Organization of African Unity, and it's this whole concept of creating an African state, a Pan-African state, and we look further down the road currently over the last 5 to 7 years at the United States of Africa. Can you talk about some of the parallels of Malcolm's vision and how it tied into that, and then where are we today with that United States of Africa?
Yeah, it appears that John Henry Clark proposed that they use the name, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, though I'm sure Malcolm had given it a lot of thought because he had observed the Organization of African Unity. That organization was proposed to Nkrumah by George Padmore, whose real name was Malcolm Nurse. Padmore was advisor to Nkrumah, principal organizer of the Fifth Pan-African Congress, which was the most important gathering of Africans in the 20th century, held in Manchester. I addressed the anniversary of that conference in 2005 in Manchester. And that meeting charted the course for African independence, and Nkrumah was the first to go back and to lead the charge for African independence. So Malcolm was learning from the international situation. The leaders in Africa were learning from him, and so he saw the need for a united front of blacks inside the United States, and he wanted to use the Organization of African Unity as a model. He was cut down before he had a chance to do that. But interestingly enough, he had meetings prior to his second trip to Africa. He had a meeting at Sidney Poitier's house where you had Dorothy Height of the Negro National Council of Negro Women. He had Martin Luther King's lawyer, who became an intermediary between King and Malcolm, though they only met once. And King voiced support for Malcolm's human rights strategy. He even had representative of the NAACP, SNCC and CORE, in that meeting, because Malcolm was trying to forge a relationship with the civil rights movement. So when he went to the Organization of African Unity for the second conference, the one where he presented a memorandum, he had the backing of a significant number of groups and had some success, which has generally been denied. So I think that was an evolving thing. So there was distortion in the autobiography. 3 chapters were left out. Manning Marvel, in his book, did not understand why. He didn't interview any nationalist scholars or use any scholarship coming from the black nationalist community. But I knew when I sponsored a rally held by the Panthers for Betty Shabazz, Malcolm's widow, in 1966, I had been attacked in the Hunters Point tribe. It was an assassination attempt. And I met with Eldridge Cleaver in my father's house, agreed to endorse that rally. And after the rally, it was reported that Betty Shabazz had stated that chapters were missing from the autobiography because the government pressured Alex Haley to keep them out. So one of the chapters that was missing was Malcolm's effort to build the Black United Front in the United States. Had that information been clear in the autobiography, the Black Panther Party might have moved in a different direction. A number of black liberation groups might have seen that the bigger strategy was unifying blacks as opposed to the self-defense strategy, which is a defensive strategy, but not one that you should be pushing as an offensive strategy. Now, in terms of looking at the African Union today, which Gaddafi played a major role in and has been overthrown, that, on the one hand, that comes out of the African-American, African-Caribbean vision that shaped Pan-Africanism. Africans in the U.S. and in the Caribbean formulated the idea of Pan-Africanism, and the very formulation of a United States of Africa sounds like the United States of America. In fact, Nkrumah was criticized for using that formulation. It was asked, wasn't that too American? But the point is, Nkrumah was educated at Lincoln University, stayed in the U.S., interacted with a lot of African Americans. And it was a progressive idea, and it developed to a higher level. The problem with the African Union is all these corrupt governments, all these leaders, take Nigeria, for example, who have creamed off all the oil wealth and put it in their pockets, when the people should be enjoying that wealth. And so for there to be a real United States of Africa, there's going to have to be a reformulation of what governance is at the national level, regional blockings, and then something that's continental, even if you keep this current thing. Because as long as you have these corrupt units are not going to accede to a continental organization, and if they did, it would be truly oppressive. So there's got to be motion from the bottom, coming from the people, and there's got to be a reformulation of what just societies are for Africa. And that's something that we, outside of Africa, have to be supportive of. And right now, the people of Africa, there are different little revolts going on. There has to be support for that.
Yes. Okay, Dr. Shaka, and I talked to a Senegalese nationalist national yesterday about the election taking place February 26th. The president of Senegal wants more than the 2 terms. As we talk about the corruption, wants more than the 2 terms that is written in the Constitution. So this is going to create a big problem over there next Sunday. Stay tuned. Dr. Shaka right back on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Muslim Street.
We'll be right back on the Muslim Street on WTAN 1340.
Every choice there awaits a greater casualty. Black Jesus pieces and pinky rings.
Hi, this is Layla Abdelaziz. Join me every Sunday, 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. for the Muslim Street with my co-host Malik Aziz. The Muslim Street will be bringing you the latest and greatest from the Muslim world. The Muslim Street will bring you a unique perspective on Muslim America, as well as Muslims living abroad. We'll be taking your calls and questions every Sunday, again from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. on WTAN 1340. Join us for the Muslim Street.
Larry G here again. The Prescription Addiction Radio Show, Breaking the Silence, is back on Tan Talk Sunday nights from 9 to 11. The only radio show in America that asks why business, industry, and churches sit silent while every community continues to fight a growing drug problem, both legal and illegal. The only radio show in America that explores the politics of drugs without the politicians. Brought to you by Novus Medical Detox, Suncoast Rehabilitation, and Chamberlain, Butler, and Crow.
One of the things that's going to help to bring this about is the independence of Africa. One of the only reasons that we in the West have never organized, we have hated our image and our African image. And because Africa has been in the hands of people who have created an image of Africa that's negative and hateful. And it has been hateful to us. We haven't wanted to identify with it. But now that Africa is getting independent and in a position to create its own image, and it's a positive image, those of us in the West look at the African image and see how positive it is. We begin to identify with it. We become proud of Africa, and we become proud of our African blood, our African heritage. And this is what is beginning to make the Africans in the Western Hemisphere today develop more race pride. And as this race pride develops, then it has a tendency to make us want to unite together and work together. And your Western imperialists and colonialists consider this to be a grave threat.
You listen to the voice of Malcolm X, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, who was gunned down February 25th, 1965 in the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, New York. We're on with Dr. Oba T Shaka. Dr. T Shaka, before we went to the break, we got a couple callers who will come in this segment. But before we went to the break, we talked a little bit about Alex Haley and the missing of a few chapters out of the autobiography. I can remember when I was a teenager picking up the Malcolm X edited speeches by George Brittman, reading The Death and Life of Malcolm X by Peter Goldman, Trotskyites, who kind of forced Malcolm into, again, their own agenda, unbeknownst to me, because I'm a teenager, I'm just picking up everything I can on Malcolm in order to develop my consciousness. Can you talk a little bit about some of the material that's out there on Malcolm, and you touched on how the Black Panther Party, had they been afforded all of the information as vis-a-vis the National Black United Front that Malcolm was speaking into in the United States, how different things would have been.
Yeah, they say that there's an African saying that the lions in the jungle and the animals in the jungle would never say of the dead lion, of the living lion, what they say when he's dead. And so when Malcolm was dead, then they could come up and really try and alter his image. And so in the case of the autobiography, Manning Marvel has a new book out now, and he's dead. He died just when the book came out. It's called The Reinvention of Malcolm X, but he's talking about how Malcolm reinvented his criminal path when, had he bothered to really go into the deep black scholarship on Malcolm, he would have known that it was the government that did the biggest invention of Malcolm's image and message by seeing that certain key elements of his message were left out. And in the case of other writers, Breitman, who was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, where Malcolm addressed after being forced out of the Nation of Islam, they had their hands on a lot of his speeches, and as you point out, they edited those speeches. They particularly would edit out black nationalist remarks, but claiming to embrace black nationalism at the same time. Breitman's thesis was, in the nation, Malcolm was a pure and simple black nationalist, but out of the nation he became a black nationalist plus a revolutionary. And he was implying and stating that he was moving towards socialism. Now, this suggests that in the Nation of Islam was pure and simple, implying maybe racist because they call whites devils, but that he was not a revolutionary in the Nation of Islam. In truth, he was a revolutionary in the Nation of Islam, and this was a problem he had with Elijah Muhammad. I mean, when he's meeting with Fidel Castro, Elijah didn't like that. And when he wanted to retaliate against police violence, where they murdered a Muslim and wounded, paralyzed another in Los Angeles,
yeah.
Elijah wouldn't respond. So this idea that a black nationalist can't be a revolutionary is, of course, a myth. The Haitians had a revolution. They were nationalists and Pan-Africanists in the sense that they supported global struggles of African people and Latin people before Marx was on the scene. So this is a myth. In the case of Goldman, who wrote the book The Death and Life of Malcolm X, was interesting. I called Tony Brown when my book came out. It came out in 1984. Told him I had a book, Tony Brown, has Tony Brown Journal.
Yes.
And asked him, told him I'd send him a copy, told him what the book was about. And then a year later, I turn on TV and he's interviewing Peter Goldman. Now, Peter Goldman's book, The Death and Life of Malcolm X. Why would you focus on the death first in a title? But then it's clear this was a reporter, a Jewish reporter that knew Malcolm. Mm-hmm. He had a major contract from a major publisher. His thesis is that Malcolm was not a fundraiser. He was not a seminal thinker. He was not a major organizer. He was a prophet. Now, I think what he meant was he wasn't any of these other things after he left the Nation of Islam. He certainly couldn't have meant that he wasn't a fundraiser in the nation. He took the nation from a broke organization to an organization with $75 million in assets and turned over all the money that he got from speaking honorariums and everything else to the nation.
And he was a key organizer, the key organizer in the Nation of Islam.
He was the key one that built the mosque and everything else. He's the second best organizer produced by blacks in the 20th century. Garvey exceeding him in numbers, Malcolm building the best disciplined organization. And then he gives them the one concession. He's a prophet. That's kind of like the kiss of death. He was prophetic. He wasn't a prophet. I mean, he never claimed to be Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, or in his league. He never claimed to be like the Buddha or Jesus Christ. He didn't claim that. He did have the gift of predicting some things, which he never claimed he had, because many of his predictions came true after his death. So all of these were ways to distort the image and make it either suit a particular ideology or organization or make it acceptable to the system. And my book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, was written to let him speak for himself. And I tried to do that. And, I think John Henry Clark's Malcolm X, the Man in His Times, which John was kind enough to let me go through his rooms and look at stuff that he had on Malcolm. He was a principal African advisor for Malcolm. His excellent work. So there are works out there that are good, but there are works that are clearly a hit on Malcolm's image.
And Dr. Clark again.
Salam alaikum, Malik. This is Layla. I've been waiting for the right moment to jump in.
Welcome.
I didn't want to interrupt the doctor, but I'm so sorry. I was just made available now.
And no problem. We're on with Dr. Oba T Shaka, and that's my co-host, Dr. T Shaka, Layla Abdelaziz, who, as we talk about fundraising, is off-site at a fundraising event. Layla, I hope that you raised a lot of money for your political organization. Dr. T Shaka, Layla is a Palestinian American. She's an activist. I like to call her the international superstar. So we talked earlier, Layla, with Dr. T Shaka about the growing influence of Malcolm X inside of the immigrant Muslim community in the United States, and we talk about just a renewed activism. And do you have any questions for Dr. T Shaka around that theme before we move to some callers?
Of course. I mean, I know that we do have Dr. White on the line waiting to ask a question, but thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us on the Street, and I really do. I have to apologize for jumping in so late. But, I'd like to put in my 2 cents about this a little bit. I think that as we discussed in last week's show, Malcolm X and his legacy is extremely crucial today because of how timeless and how important it is, because it calls upon self-reflection before anything else. And I think in general, when a community self-reflects, there's always room for improvement. There's always room there for development. And that really calls for the immigrant community today as they try to find their voice in the United States, in a country with so many opinions and so many voices. I think most immigrant communities that are looking to develop their leadership are falling back on the legacy and the teachings of Malcolm X. But we have Dr. White on the line who has a question. Dr. White?
Yes, good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum.
Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah, brother Doctor, welcome to Florida by way of the radio.
Thank you.
I like Malik radio materials when I was in graduate school, and I was always impressed by them. But I want to go back to the Paul Robeson thing you was talking about, and I'm interested in knowing how did Malcolm was able to get his materials, read his materials in jail, because
Malcolm listened to him on the radio because Robeson was on the radio. This was during the period in which he was fighting the U.S. government. You know, they were grounding him, not allowing him to travel to international venues where he could perform. And so he was on the radio every week, and so Malcolm was listening. One of the shows was FDR's wife. She interviewed him, but he had a number of radio broadcasts, and Malcolm listened very attentively. That was his greatest hero, Paul Robeson. Yeah. He had one opportunity to meet him. And, you know, I think one of the things that's most important about the two, these were two people who had great integrity. Neither one of these people compromised on their principles. Right. And I think that that's part of what inspired Malcolm. They were also two very brilliant persons, but it was their incorruptibility that I think was, the most important common point that they shared.
All right. Well, thank you, and I again welcome to the area. And I've been enjoying your comments. Look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, thanks for the call. And Dr. Shaka, we're going to have to get you down here to Florida, Layla, as we talk about a key organizer, a man with so much wealth and knowledge. Please, Dr. Shaka, hold on to the other side of the break. You're listening to The Muslim Street with Malik Aziz and Layla Abdulaziz.
You're listening to WTAN 1340, The Muslim Street. You can follow us at muslimstreet.net or on Facebook, Muslim Street. Hi, this is Layla Abdelaziz. Join me every Sunday, 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. for The Muslim Street with my co-host, Malik Aziz. The Muslim Street will be bringing you the latest and greatest from the Muslim world. The Muslim Street will bring you a unique perspective on Muslim America, as well as Muslims living abroad. We'll be taking your calls and questions every Sunday, again from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. on WTAN 1340. Join us for The Muslim Street.
Larry G. here again. The Prescription Addiction Radio Show, Breaking the Silence, is back on Tan Talk Sunday nights from 9 to 11. The only radio show in America that asks why business, industry, and churches sit silent while every community continues to fight a growing drug problem, both legal and illegal. The only radio show in America that explores the politics of drugs without the politicians. Brought to you by Novus Medical Detox, Suncoast Rehabilitation, and Chamberlain, Butler, and Crow.
My name is Hassan Shibli. I'm the Executive Director of CARE Tampa, www.cairtampa.org, and I listen to The Muslim Street on Tan Talk Radio every Sunday at 8 p.m.
Malcolm, what is your purpose here? Well, my purpose here is to remind the African heads of state that there are 22 million of us in America who are also of African descent, and to remind them also that we are the victims of America's colonialism or American imperialism, and that our problem is not an American problem, it's a human problem. It's not a Negro problem, it's a problem of humanity. It's not a problem of civil rights, but a problem of human rights. And what do you hope for from this?
Welcome back to the Muslim Street. We're here at WTAN with Dr. Oba T Shaka. I am Malik Aziz with my co-host Layla Abdulaziz. Dr. Shaka, we were I was talking earlier about my thirst for information and my finding of some of the books on Malcolm in my infantile stage of my development in terms of my consciousness. When I first heard you speak in Chicago at the Center for Inner City Studies on the platform of Malcolm X's the anniversary of his assassination, when I heard you, I heard Malcolm. When I saw you, even then on a physical perspective, you looked like Malcolm. And as we talk about Malcolm X today and your work in the revolutionary struggle, if Malcolm was in the United States in the context of this attack on Muslim immigrants, the Palestinian question, which is at the heart of the Muslim world, what do you see yourself parallel to Malcolm in response to that issue?
My own response or his?
Yours and Malcolm's. I mean, will Malcolm be in the mix today, and then also talk about your perspective on it?
Yeah, I think he definitely would. I mean, his views are in many ways relevant today, though there are things that have changed that would require him to take a different look at certain things. But I think that in terms of Islamic people who are in this country, Americans or people who are living in this country, Malcolm would see that they're an important part of any kind of transformation of this society and would be reaching out to them. I think that it was clear by the end of his life that he saw a need to relate to different communities, but principally to organize black people. But he saw the need to understand where radical whites were coming from and saw the need to look at where other groups were coming from. So, I think that in terms of the role of Israel and the way it has repressed the Palestinian people, it has been vicious, and there's been no outcry in this country. The Zionist state of Israel has a real impact on politics when it comes to particularly the Palestinians, also Iran. Though America has the final say-so on Iran. So,
Doctor,
I think that...
if you would let me, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if you would let me ask you a question right there, because I think this is, me as a Palestinian, I'm a refugee, I was born in Palestine. Palestine means a lot to me, and as an activist and a community leader here in the United States, one thing that we're always asking ourselves is, and one thing that I'm always learning, especially the more that I get to know the community that I work and I live in, is it's not that there is no outcry. It's just that there's greater factors in play here. How does a conscious mind fight a greedy mind in terms of, the Zionist lobby here in the United States and the control on money and the politicians? It's not necessarily that there's no outcry. It's just that how do you fight with?
I'm not referring to no outcry from Palestinians. I'm referring to no outcry from major political organizations in this country. There's some radical whites that say something.
Wouldn't you credit that to the fact of the stronghold of the Zionist lobby, which in fact would be money and re-election and support and et cetera?
Control of media and a lot of other things. But, I think that that's a that's a problem that Palestinians are going to have to work out in terms of strategy. But, I think that clearly in terms of the Gaza, West Bank, that there's been a move to just knock out infrastructure and to keep the Palestinians ground into the dust. And, there has got to be support for the Palestinian people here. Now, in terms of my position, in terms of change positions, I think that if Malcolm were alive today, there are certain things that he proposed in the 60s that are relevant today. There are certain things that have changed. He's relevant in terms of this united front. We need that in terms of Black United Front, but in a different way, not in the way that he conceived of it, in that vanguard organizations are not going to work. There's no vanguard organization going to lead us to freedom. There's not going to be any one group of people that's going to come together and forge the path for Black people. Our people here are going to have to free themselves, but there's going to have to be unity that enables them to do that. But one of the changed conditions that Malcolm would have to face that he did not predict is the marginalization of the youth. Black youth, African youth have been marginalized. And what I mean by that is they're outside of the economy. With the deindustrialization of America, if people do not have high-tech skills, they don't have a future in the economy, especially people of color, especially Black people. And that's true in Africa. That's true here. Structural adjustment plays that role in Africa. Here, deindustrialization and all those policies do. The generation gap has emerged as a most serious internal issue that faces the Black community, and it arises not so much from age, but from economic and political and social circumstance. The youth of today, Black youth, and a growing number of other youth, including white youth, find themselves in this position where their economic condition is guaranteed to be worse than that of their parents, and their parents weren't all that great, if you're talking about averages. So there's a whole need to come up with different strategies around that to unify the young and the old in a common struggle. Malcolm was approaching a question that he didn't get into deeply because he didn't have time to, and that's the question of a reappraisal of African American culture. Malcolm had contradictory positions on that, in that the Nation of Islam tended to put down African American culture, not to really appreciate it. Malcolm would talk about how slavery had destroyed our culture, but because of his street experience and his own knowledge and his appreciation of African American music and culture, he would also talk about the creative nature of it. It's the culture of our people that is the driving force for transformation and for liberation. And I think that Malcolm would have undergone a much deeper appreciation of that culture, which he was beginning to do by the end of his life. And I think that that's a extremely important part, because new African culture, which is what I call it, is one of only two indigenous cultures in this country. The other is Native American, meaning it grew here. And it is the culture of popular choice, and it is the culture that counters the oppressive culture of Euro-American culture. And it is a weakness of our people, Black people in this country, that we have not done a proper appraisal of this culture. And I think that Malcolm would have been a part of that, because he was a reader and he was in constant touch with change and transformation in the community. People look at Malcolm's impact on the movement. They often don't look at the movement's impact on Malcolm. It was a two-way thing with him. He was a good listener in public. And so I think that he would have been responding to some of these new nuances that are very, very important.
Yeah, Dr. T Shaka, Malcolm's, you write in your book, Political Legacy of Malcolm X, a chapter on Malcolm's long-range program. As we talk about earlier in the conversation about Malcolm's travels through the Middle East, through Africa, bumping up against revolutionary movements as they emerged from Western colonialism, this embracing of the Bandung Conference and that whole ideology. As we move forward today, what's next? What are our next steps?
Well, I think that one of the things that has been really ignored in terms of Malcolm, and it also speaks to the next step, is his last message. That speech was the most insightful. It was not his best speech. His house had been firebombed the night before. He had been sedated, and it was not a speech. It was a talk. But there were gems in there, and there was one in particular, and it speaks to now. Malcolm said before he had thought the revolution on the outside of the Western House in Africa was the most threatening. But he had come to realize it was the revolution on the inside of the Western House that was the most threatening. And he then said by that he meant that Africans who were in the Caribbean, from French-speaking Caribbean, would go to France when they went to Europe, or the British-speaking Caribbean would go to Britain. And he was talking about how those populations of black people posed a threat inside Europe. But his main point was the threat that Africans pose inside the United States. And the point he was making was, he said that we pose the greatest threat to the existence of this system, provided that we understand our strategic position, meaning located inside the United States, he said, we can mess up the furniture. What he meant was that this is a society, and Malcolm, by the end of his life, was talking about how this society was not structured to provide freedom. King reached the same conclusion when he said the problem in America is structural. So Malcolm was beginning to become a neo-Garveyite, whereas before he talked about returning to Africa physically. When he came back after his 2 trips to Africa, he said we need to return philosophically, culturally, and spiritually while we change this society. So I think that there's a short-term strategy that we have to embrace around improving the conditions of food, clothing, and shelter, not only for blacks but for oppressed people in this country. But there's a long-term question of how we transform a system in which 1% controls 80 to 90% of the wealth and grounds everyone else into the dust. That's the bigger question.
Yeah, Dr.
And that's the question that the movements of the 60s and Malcolm and King were addressing.
Yeah, Dr. Shaka, as we approach the close of the program, and Layla will have the last question for you, how do we get in touch with you? Is there a website where we can purchase your books, maybe invite you down or around the country for speaking events?
Yeah, my website is www.obatshaka.com, www.obatshaka.com.
Okay, Layla?
Thank you so much, Dr. Tashaka. I'm so sorry about that. Today, the reason I was delayed is because I work for a voter advocacy nonprofit here in the state of Florida, Emerge USA, and we were doing an event with the mayor. We were doing an event to introduce the community. We represent the South Asian, the Muslim, and the Arab communities here in the state of Florida. And we were having a fundraiser event for our upcoming events in 2012. I just wanted to get your opinion on how do you think the Muslim American community will participate in the 2012 elections? Do you think they're too disappointed in Obama to support him like they did in 2008? And how do you anticipate and predict our participation in the 2012 election?
Yeah, real quick, Layla, we might have to save that for we're down to our last 15 seconds. Dr. Tashaka, we might have to bring you back in for a second segment, part 2 of this discussion on Malcolm's struggle, the organizing piece. So much left on the table here. I want to thank Dr. Tashaka for coming in to Muslim Street, and Malika Aziz with the co-host Layla Abdullah Aziz. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.